Hello and welcome. I'm Chris Kober in Berlin. In recent months, we've heard a lot about decoupling from China. But what would it really mean to end trade ties with Beijing? Well, a new report says it could be done. Even cutting trade ties overnight would cause Germany's economy to shrink by around 5%, effect similar to the pandemic or the global financial crisis. But that initial shock could be avoided by gradually and carefully reducing trade relations. So, is it time to cut dependency on China? To address that, let's bring in Julian Hinz. He is one of the authors of that study from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. Welcome to DW, Julian. You say that a hard decoupling between the Chinese and the German economy would be akin to a, quote, Cold War 2.0. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's the name that we gave this scenario. So what we're doing is we're simulating the world economy in a fragmented world. And so in this fragmented world, we think of a world in which there's a block of friendly countries to Germany. There's a block of rivals, which includes China, as well as a block of neutral countries. And so the simulation that we're running in this model is to see what the costs would be to live in that world instead of the one that we're currently living in.
Julian, what would that fragmentation of the world then mean for global trade?
Well, as you can imagine, so by construction, this means that there's going to be a lot less global trade. Namely, we're cutting trade ties between the friendly countries. So we think of those as the G7, the Western bloc, if you will, as well as the bloc dominated by China. But both of those blocs would still be able to trade with the neutral countries. And so what you see is that there's a lot of rerouting of trade for trade that previously took place between the two now rivaling blocs. And so that is rerouted to trade within the Western bloc as well as the rival bloc and those countries trading with the neutral countries.
We can talk about that more in a second. First, let's take a look how important trade with China is for Germany. Really important, of course, as we look at the numbers. Last year, trade between Germany and China added up to just under 300 billion euros, making China the country's most important trade partner, followed by the United States with trade worth just of under 250 billion euros, and neighboring Netherlands with 227 billion euros. Julian, back to you. Hard decoupling from China, from Germany's most important trade partner, would lead to a hit to the tune of about 5% of GDP growth in Germany. Put that into perspective for us. What would that mean?
So it's important to note that this 5% drop is the very short run drop. And so why is the drop so stark in the very short run? Well, it would be very difficult for companies to find new suppliers in the very short run. It would be difficult for exporters to find new markets. But so over time, that hit significantly is significantly lower. So this 5% we're talking about the first couple of months. Over the first year, we're simulating a loss that's around 4%, and then in the long run, we would have a permanent, and that's important, a permanent loss in welfare, in how well the economy is doing by about 1.5%. And so what does that mean? That's this first drop in the very beginning is comparable to the financial crisis, the drop that we saw in economic activity during the financial crisis, or the initial COVID shock that we all experienced.
So a lot of money, obviously. Would it be worth it, though, to do such a step, to take such a step in light of how dependent China and Germany is on China?
First of all, I would say there's definitely a mutual dependence, and we see this very clearly in the numbers, in the sense that China is always hit much more severely than any of the Western countries is in such a scenario. So in that sense, China is more dependent on Western economies than vice versa. The second thing, and that's very important to note, is that in no way we're advocating for this scenario. What we're trying to do is to give policymakers solid ground on which they can base decisions. In the end, it's political decision and how and what to do in terms of decoupling, or rather de-risking strategy. And so this extreme scenario would be an abrupt decoupling that's hopefully in no one's mind in terms of policy. And in terms of policy, we would rather, if that is a desired outcome, advocate for something much more gradual.
You mentioned interesting words there, abrupt and extreme. Now, there's one policymaker in China, and that's China's State and Party leader Xi Jinping, and he's adamant that Taiwan is to be made a part of China. The U.S. has been vying support for Taiwan militarily in a case in which China would invade the democratic island. Now, Taiwan is the biggest maker of chips in the world, and I wonder how big the impact of an armed conflict would be on these highly sought-after parts, even though they don't come from China, but obviously trade with Taiwan, with chips, somewhat is China-related in this geopolitical realm.
That's true, and that's obviously one of the lessons I think we can draw from working on this study, is that obviously there are certain sectors for which the dependency on outside suppliers is quite high. But I think what becomes clear is that, and we've seen this in the past year as well when we talked about Russian gas, is that market forces are quite strong in the sense that there will be new suppliers. This is, of course, nothing that happens in the very short run. This is something that happens over months, and then probably in the case of chips, also over the course of years. But that significantly dampens the effect. So we're not living in this catastrophic world in the moment that something happens. Rather, market forces can help us avoid these very, very dramatic outcomes, and we see something that's a lot more manageable than one would initially expect.
Now, obviously, you're not a policymaker, I'm not a policymaker, but if we look at the world we're in right now, we see these developments with new chip factories that are being built or that are intended to be built when it comes to catering to this very important market. Do you think that this is happening fast enough compared to how the political climate is in Beijing?
I think, and that's again something that we learned from the study, is that everyone has to lose in a scenario in which this abrupt decoupling happens. And so my hope, my guess, and you're right, I'm definitely not a policymaker, but as a citizen, I sincerely hope that this is not something that we're steering towards. And so I think we can understand those as a mechanism of ensuring against such an event. And so we have a model simulation for this type of scenario as well, where a gradual decoupling, or as it's sometimes called, de-risking, so small yard, high fence type of policy, that is significantly less costly than these abrupt shocks. And so I hope that if that's the scenario that we're steering towards, a fragmentation of the world economy, that this happens gradually and not abruptly.
Okay, Julian, let's stay in the present then with this matter, taking a closer look at what kind of goods are exchanged between Germany and China. Germany's exports to China include cars and car parts, engine parts, planes and helicopters, but also chemicals and metals, whereas China's main exports to Germany include computers, office and broadcasting equipment, as well as shoes and textiles. Julian, back to you. So in the case of a hard decoupling, it is basically the German automotive, aviation, and chemicals industries that would be the ones taking the biggest hit here.
For sure, for those sectors, this would be a hard hit, as it would be for any sector that is involved in trading with China. Then again, I think it's important to see in perspective in how important China is in exports or imports of these sectors for the German economy, and then take that also into perspective into seeing how important exports are of these sectors for the entire German economy. And when you do that, then the average share of exports, or the importance of China in total, in everything that's produced in Germany, in terms of what's produced here and then sold to China, we're talking about something that's between 2 and 3% of German production that actually goes to China. Okay, so again, the number may seem dramatically lower than you would guess, and that is because China is, of course, a very important trading partner, but it's a big country, but it's relatively far away, and the Chinese market is not as important for the entire economy as one would expect. So shocks closer to home, so to say, those would matter a lot more.
There are sectors, though, economic sectors, where China is the most important market. And we both know, for example, the automotive industry, auto industry is such a case. There are big players who are present on the market and who are viewing, obviously, the current geopolitical developments. And there have been representatives of German car makers that have been saying, our goal is to produce for China, in China, basically not delivering any parts, any goods that are necessary to keep up that production at all, to make it self-sufficient and keep that China entity basically secluded from every other business. Is that the right way to go if one company wants to continue doing business with China and also be on the safe side?
Well, foreign direct investment is, of course, one strategy that has been tried and tested, so to say, in the past. And you named the German automotive industry, which has so numerous companies have plants in China to serve the Chinese market directly. Now it's a question of in a decoupling scenario. I guess it would also be quite likely that this would also be affected. It's obviously speculation as to how that would work. Again, though, so we're not arguing that China is too small to matter. No, by far, so far from it. And especially for a number of companies, big companies even, China is an important market where lots of revenue is generated, where a lot of the value goes actually or comes from. Then again, what we try to emphasize is that if you put this at the grand scale, at the economy-wide scale, even those big companies do not matter to the degree that some people think they do, or the public perceives them as they do. And so for some companies, for sure, this would be a near catastrophic event for the entire economy. And that's that we think is worth emphasizing. It would be severe, but definitely not catastrophic.
Julian, I want to focus on one aspect that was not mentioned in the study. I mean, you and your colleagues have been talking a lot about goods that have been produced that go in between these two countries, between Germany and China, back and forth, that are imported and exported. But a major factor of the German dependency on China is commodities, is rare earths. Again, in the case of a hard decoupling, one could very vividly imagine that China would say, well, we will stop providing you with rare earths and these minerals that are so essential in making mobile phones and others. So how does that factor in?
No, so we actually do talk about it quite extensively in the paper, because that of course is one issue that is relevant, and that has been identified already by policymakers as being an important part to consider in any sort of risk analysis when it comes to trade links. And so what we show is that the additional effect that these very specific parts could have on overall economic outcomes cannot be as big as really to change the conclusion of our results. So we have some simulations in which we tell the model essentially that it's super difficult to exchange, to substitute any types of products like rare earths towards something else. And yet the results really are, we're talking about 1 percentage point higher losses than we do in our benchmark analysis.
As we are living in times when the German government and others are reassessing their relationship with Beijing, obviously, China has been saying it opposes any sort of what Beijing calls decoupling. Western officials like German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is talking about de-risking. Looking at what's going on, looking at the China strategy that the German government has published a couple of weeks ago, which term, decoupling or de-risking, in your point of view, is the most accurate to describe what's going on right now?
I think decoupling is really cutting, severing trade ties. And if you just look at the raw data, that's clearly not what's happening. So we can think of this really more as a de-risking. If that's something that is going on, then we should think of this as de-risking in the sense that for certain sectors, for certain products, we just mentioned rare earths, it's quite sensible to have not just one supplier, but a multitude of suppliers that could supply these important things to German companies.
Julian Hinz of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. Julian, thank you very much for your insights. And that is all from this DW Business Look at what decoupling from China would look like. There's plenty more from us here on the DW News YouTube channel. I'm Chris Colbert in Berlin. See you soon.